How has the Constitution been changed to further the ideals contained in the Declaration of Independence? Reacting to the Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford, Abraham Lincoln said, "But we think the Dred Scott decision is erroneous. We know that the court that made it has often overruled its own decisions, and we shall do what we can to have it overrule this." We offer the resistance to it. Why did Lincoln believe that the Supreme Court's decision was wrong? Why and how did Lincoln and others work to see the Dred Scott case was overturned? And why do you think Lincoln said he would support no resistance, such as mass demonstrations or other revolutionary behavior, to overturn Dred Scott? You may begin.
Lincoln believed that the Dred Scott decision was wrong because the circumstances under which it was made proved it to be an erroneous decision. The Dred Scott case was a case in which a slave named Dred Scott sued his master. Scott sued his master because he visited the Free State, Illinois, and the Free Territory of Wisconsin. He ran away but was later returned to Missouri, which became an official slave state due to the Missouri Compromise. Scott felt that because he visited in both a free state and territory that he should be a free man. He lost his cases in the Supreme Court of Missouri, the Circuit Court of Missouri, and the U.S. Supreme Court.
The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that African Americans weren't citizens. They were property, and even if slaves are in free territories or states, they still belong to their masters. Lincoln disagreed with this ruling. He stated that if this important decision had been made without any partisan bias and in accordance with the League of Public Expectation, and had been in no part based upon assumed historical facts, which are not really true, it might then be, perhaps would be, factitious, nay, even revolutionary, not to acquiesce in this precedent.
Lincoln made it clear that there were numerous reasons why the Dred Scott decision was flawed. The most critical of these flaws is that the Dred Scott decision was made on the basis of false assumed historical facts. The court ruled that Negroes were no part of who made or for whom was made the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution of the United States, in spite of the fact that free Negroes in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and North Carolina were voters, and in proportion to their numbers had the same part in making the Constitution that white people had. This shows that Lincoln believed the Dred Scott decision was based on false historical facts about African Americans' role in the Constitution. He believed that the famous line of the Declaration of Independence stating, "All men are created equal," meant to include all men, despite of race. He criticized the court's decision and other opponents by saying that slaves were only viewed as human beings when it was convenient for those in power.
Lincoln also knew that the Dred Scott decision would tear the Union apart. Primarily for that reason, Lincoln knew he needed to work to get the case overturned. Lincoln stated, "My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all of the slaves, I would do it."
With this unsettling decision on the Dred Scott case and growing tensions between the North and South, it could have been assumed that any action decided to take would be drastic. Lincoln was able to see that the Dred Scott case was overturned through publicly speaking about it.
Lincoln made it very clear that he showed no resistance towards the judicial branch, and that he had the utmost respect for the judicial branch. He believed that when fully settled, the judicial branch could control not only the particular cases decided, but the general policy of the country. Lincoln saw the overturning of the Dred Scott case more as a responsibility as a president than an outright opposition towards the judicial branch. Although Lincoln wanted to change the Dred Scott decision, he knew that to do so was not within his power. Also, to speak out on it was not considered as resistance in his eyes. For speaking out on a decision that was wrong is not resistance. It is only the right exercise as freedom of speech.
What were the most important issues to you in the Dred Scott case?
Well, it had a lot. The most important issue pretty much was the issue of slavery, considering the fact that that was the big problem within the Union, like North versus South, and it was what was essentially tearing the Union apart. And it was also a big issue within the government because of the fact that the Supreme Court made a decision that the president didn't see was a good decision. So the governmental issue and the issue regarding slavery were the two main issues in the case.
I would like to say that Another issue is that judicial review is controversial, and that even presidents don't have the power to change those decisions, and they have to realize that it takes that acts that policies that the judicial branch makes can be overruled, or they can notice their mistakes later and change them.
When the Supreme Court ruled on the Dred Scott case, they did so in the context, or in other words, their understanding of the Constitution, right? It wasn't just a ruling on the circumstances of that case, it was also a decision about what the Constitution meant. But how has the Constitution changed since then so that a similar Supreme Court today would rule differently?
It's changed because of the since then, because of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So now African Americans can vote, they're considered citizens, and no person can be, prosecuted without due process of law. So now you can't say that someone can't sue in court because they're not a person. So now, because of amendments to the Constitution, more have been added. So a Supreme Court today would rule differently.
You spoke a lot about how Lincoln considered the Union as a deciding factor in why he wanted to oppose the court decision. What do you personally think? The Constitution was there, but do you think that should have been a factor? Or should it have only been, we the people are equal? Should that have been his deciding factor, or the situation of the Union?
I think that Lincoln knew that slavery was part of the problem while the North and the South were having tensions between each other. So he knew that he had to be careful when addressing the Dred Scott issue because it could lead to war, which it did lead to the Civil War.
And also, when you speak of the people, slaves were people, but the North and the South were like pretty much the people. So he had to do what would be the best decision to make them happy and also include everyone as equal people. So he had to consider the Union as a president instead of just making a rash decision about slavery that would tear the Union apart.
If a decision of that magnitude came about with the current president, what should the factors be considered? Should the Union as a whole, or should the individual rights be considered when making decisions?
I think that it depends on the situation, because our government is basically, individual rights and the common good. So based on the Constitution now, the amendments that have been added, they focus a lot on individual rights. So I think maybe today individual rights will probably be looked at a little more than the common good or the Union as a whole.
Dred Scott has been called one of the most important Supreme Court decisions in American history. Do you agree or disagree? Why or why not?
I agree because, if that decision wouldn't have been made, who knows how long it would have been before slavery ended, and so that's why I think it's important.
I also agree that the decision is probably the most important, not just because the decision itself, but what came from it, which is Lincoln overturning it and the tensions between the Union.
Also, I would like to add that it's important because of the governmental aspect of it, because the Supreme Court made a decision that later had to be overturned because of an amendment, and that's really important, like that the Supreme Court can overturn its own decisions and be overturned because of amendments. And in that case, it was a decision that was wrong, that because of presidential speaking out on it and everything got overturned. So it's a really important example when looking back on the history of our Constitution and checks and balances.
From a political standpoint, so we've talked about the Constitution, part of this, but you also mentioned during your opening statement that there were a lot of political considerations that went into the Supreme Court's decision, and there were political considerations that went into Abraham Lincoln's opposition to their decision. So let's talk about it now from that political standpoint. Should the Supreme Court have allowed politics to weigh on their decision? If yes, why? If no, why?
Well, I think when thinking about political parties, they're always looking out for the best interests of their party, but at the same time, they have to look out for the interests of the common good. So it might not be best for them to have thinking about the political aspects at that time.